The emergency alarm screamed through the cold, pressurized recovery bay of the Ethelgard Corp flagship, and CEO Alistair Cray felt his three hearts, or rather his cold ambition, thrum with a predatory satisfaction. He had spent years and billions chasing the convenient myth of the Terran sector, a region classified by the Galactic Council as a Class 12 death world. To the rest of the galaxy, humans were bipedal prey that apologized when you stepped on their feet. To Cray, they were a resource waiting to be harvested. Cray stood before a reinforced containment unit where a shifting, oily mass of black matter pulsed like a dying star. The scouts called it exotic livestock. Cray whispered to his lead scientist, his voice dripping with the condescension of a species that had never needed to show primitive determination. But this void pulse is the key to our expansion. It only needs a host to give it focus. Cray assumed that bonding these creatures to primitive human subjects would be simple, an easy conquest of biology. He had no idea he was playing with a nightmare he couldn't control. Miles away, Jackson Reed sat in his cramped apartment, nursing a bruised ego and a folder full of evidence that could destroy Ethelgard Corp. Jackson was a disgraced investigative journalist, a man who had spent his life being hunted by things bigger and meaner than him. He was a death worlder, born on a planet where the gravity, the weather, and the microbial life were designed specifically to cause maximum trauma. Cray saw humans as soft. Jackson Reed was the living proof that humans were actually predators with table manners. Driven by a whistleblower's tip, Jackson infiltrated the Ethelgard facility under the cover of a massive storm. He navigated the security grids with a creative violence that the corporation's sophisticated sensors weren't calibrated to recognize. He reached the primary laboratory finding rows of volunteers who had been sacrificed in Thorne's failed trials, subjects who had suffered catastrophic security breaches of the soul. As Jackson shattered the containment glass to rescue a survivor, the void pulse didn't just escape, it recognized him. It sensed a host whose ancestors had climbed to the top of Earth's food chain, not through strength but through terrifying persistence. The liquid ebony mass lunged, sliding beneath Jackson's skin, and merging with his nervous system in a display of biological magnetic force. Jackson felt his stomachs drop as the creature's consciousness collided with his own, screaming in a pitch that promised future violence. The lab's blast doors hissed open, and 12 elite Shadowborn assassins entered, their ceremonial armor gleaming under the red emergency lights. They saw one human, unarmed and trembling in the dark. Cray, watching through a surveillance satellite, prepared to order immediate relocation to a pine box. But Jackson Reed stood up. His eyes didn't just reflect the room. They pulsed with a dark energy that space itself seemed to fear. He took a long, slow breath through his nose, his jaw clenching with a weight that made the assassin's survival instinct scream. "Now," Jackson said, his voice dropping to a terrifying dual-toned growl that rattled the reinforced bulkheads. "I'm actually getting annoyed." The assassins froze, their faceplates turning pale gray as they realized they were no longer looking at prey. The 12 Shadowborn assassins didn't wait for a second warning. Each of these killers cost the Ethelgard Corp more to train than a small planetary defense system. They were legendary operatives trained from birth in 17 different killing arts, and they moved with a lethal, synchronized grace. But as they opened fire, Jackson Reed's body didn't collapse. It exploded into a blur of creative violence. Inside his mind, the void pulse was screaming in pure existential shock. It had bonded with hundreds of species across the galaxy, but it had never encountered anything like human biology. A Class 12 death world organism. The symbiote felt Jackson's adrenaline spike to levels that would have liquefied the organs of a lesser species. It realized that Jackson was an apex predator, born from a planet so hostile that merely existing there was a military training exercise. The void pulse attempted to take total control, but it hit a wall of terrifying persistence. Jackson wasn't just a host, he was a participant. "What are you doing?" the void pulse hissed inside his skull. "Surviving," Jackson grunted back. "It's what we're best at." Jackson lunged across the laboratory, his movement defying the physics Thorne's team thought they understood. He didn't just punch. He utilized the environment with a predatory cunning. He ripped a pressurized coolant pipe from the ceiling, using the freezing gas to blind the lead assassin while the void pulse extended ebony tendrils to shatter the operative's reinforced faceplate. The Shadowborn, legendary for their efficiency, were being systematically dismantled in a span of 45 seconds. CEO Alistair Cray watched the footage from the command deck, his three eyes, or rather his cold gaze, blinking in a sign of genuine confusion. He had heard the whispered tales of the terrifying humans from the edge of explored space, but he had dismissed them as folklore, the galactic equivalent of checking under a sleeping pod for monsters. Now he was watching a single human relocate 12 of his finest killers to a pine box 6 feet under. "They bare their teeth when they're happy," Cray whispered, recalling an old diplomatic report. But on the screen, Jackson wasn't happy. He was showing his teeth in a promise of violence that space itself seemed to fear. As the last assassin fell, Jackson looked directly into the security camera. His face was an alarming shade of red, a biological tell that probably meant he was either dying or extremely angry. Possibly both. He wasn't breathing like a man who had just fought a war. He was breathing carefully, counting in his head, reaching the final edge of a cliff marked consequences. "You made a mistake, Cray," Jackson growled, his voice now fully synchronized with the void pulse. "You thought we were livestock." Suddenly, the laboratory's thermal output began to spike. Something biological was emerging from Jackson's chest, something iridescent that hurt to perceive. The void pulse was no longer just a guest. It was unfurling with a terrible grace, transforming Jackson into a titan. "We're coming for the rest of your list," Jackson promised, as he leapt through a reinforced observation window, disappearing into the dark of the storm. Cray turned to his tactical officer, his skin rippling with profound unease. "Has anyone actually studied what the humans were doing before we attacked?" Before the officer could answer, a new alert flooded the station's neural interface. The Sanguine Terror, Cray's second biological asset, had just broken its own containment. Rain lashed against the rusted shipping containers of the wharf district as Jackson Reed leaned against a cold metal wall, his breath coming in ragged hitches. Inside his mind, the void pulse was a vibrating coil of black hunger, confused by the restraint its host was showing. "Why, hide?" the creature hissed, its voice a static heavy rasp in Jackson's ears. "We can feast. Their hearts pulse with fear because we're trying to be polite," Jackson muttered, wiping rain from his eyes. "It's stage 1. Normal human behavior." Suddenly, the floodlights of 3 Ethelgard Corp gunships cut through the dark, pinning Jackson against the steel. Dozens of tactical reclamation officers in heavy atmospheric suits surrounded the area, their weapons whining as they powered up. A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. Commander Vane, a cold, methodical leader who had overseen the relocation of 3 human colonies. "Jackson Reed, you are in possession of Ethelgard property. Surrender the biological asset immediately or face terminal extraction." Jackson stepped into the light, hands raised. He didn't look like a titan. He looked like a tired man in a soaked jacket. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice steady despite the dozens of rifles pointed at his head. "I think there's been an issue here. You're trespassing in a civilian zone. I'm asking you to stand down." "That's stage 2, Jackson whispered to the symbiote, identifying the issue. Commander Vane didn't care about stages. He gestured, and 2 officers fired sonic disruptors, weapons designed to tear a void pulse from its host. The high-frequency waves slammed into Jackson, making his skin ripple like oil on water. He dropped to one knee, a pained, tight smile forming on his face. A smile that showed too many teeth and didn't reach his eyes at all. "Stage 3, Jackson growled through gritted teeth. "The smile gets tight. I'm counting in my head now." "Fire again," Vane ordered, his voice echoing through the yard. Jackson took a long, slow breath through his nose, his weight shifting in a way that made the surrounding officers, creatures from 100 different worlds, feel a primal fear they hadn't experienced in centuries. He wasn't just a host anymore, he was a death worlder, reminding the galaxy why his planet was a nightmare. The air temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as Jackson looked directly at the nearest gunship. He stood up slowly, the black ichor of the void pulse beginning to coat his arms like liquid obsidian. "Now," Jackson said, his voice dropping to a dual-toned, terrifyingly calm whisper that carried over the rain. "I'm actually getting annoyed." The entire wharf district went silent. The Vraxian haulers in the distance stopped chittering. Even the gunship engines seemed to hold their breath. In the Ethelgard Command Center, CEO Alistair Cray watched the biomonitors of his troops. He saw the heart rates of his elite soldiers spike into the red. They had crossed the line. They were now standing at the edge of a cliff marked consequences. Before Vane could give the next order, Jackson wasn't there. He was a blur of ebony motion, a pack of predators contained in a single body. The extraction pods launched from the Ethelgard Corp station in a coordinated silent strike, invisible to the scanning systems of the lower atmosphere. CEO Alistair Cray sat in his observation deck, watching 12 of the most elite killers in the galaxy, the Shadowborn, prepare to board. To Cray, sending 12 legendary operatives for one human journalist was a necessary message. The Zenith Initiative did not tolerate theft. Each Shadowborn was trained from birth in 17 different killing arts, and each cost more to produce than a small planetary defense system. Cray savored the anticipation, convinced the Shadowborn don't fail. 4 hours later, the first alarm went off. Inside the darkened shipyard, Jackson Reed didn't look like he was struggling. He looked like he was working. He had moved past the annoyance phase and into a state of surgical precision, treating the 12 million credit hit squad like a logistics and resource problem. The void pulse pulsed beneath his skin, its dark energy unmaking the molecular bonds of anything it touched. The Shadowborn, despite their redundant organ systems and heavy armor, were finding that Deathworlder physics didn't care about their training. On Cray's command deck, the tactical display flickered. "We've lost contact with Insertion Team Alpha," the communications officer reported, his skin turning a pale, terrified green. 3 biomonitors flatlined within a span of 45 seconds. Before Cray could bark an order, Team Beta went dark, followed by Charlie. 9 of the 12 legendary killers had been incapacitated or killed in less time than it took to process a trade report. Cray roared for a visual, his previous smug satisfaction evaporating like water on an airless moon. When the satellite image finally resolved, the room went deathly quiet. Jackson Reed was sitting on a rusted shipping crate, calmly drinking from a ceramic mug as steam rose into the cold, rainy air. He looked relaxed, as if he hadn't just dismantled the galaxy's most feared operatives. Around him, the 12 Shadowborn were arranged in a neat chronological circle. Jackson had positioned them exactly where they had approached from, proving he had read Cray's Level 9 encrypted tactical plan like a children's story. Jackson stood up, set down his mug, and held a Shadowborn combat blade toward the camera. Etched into the flat of the metal in perfect script were 5 words: "Send better assassins next time." "Impossible," Cray whispered, his mandibles, or rather his jaw, clenching until it nearly cracked. He had spent 73 cycles assuming humans were harmless because they smiled too much. He had ignored the cardinal rule of warfare: never judge a species by how they act in peacetime. Jackson Reed wasn't just defending himself, he was positioning humanity as a sovereign entity. He looked back at the fallen assassins and then up at the satellite, his eyes glowing with the void pulse's cold, milky white light. "You taught us that real monsters speak in terms of acceptable casualties." Jackson's voice boomed through the open communication channel, vibrating with a dual-toned menace. "Now I'm going to show you what a Deathworlder does when you threaten his family." In the distance, the ground began to shake. Cray's orbital sensors picked up a new, massive signature, something biological and metallic rising from the bay's depths. It was the Sanguine Terror, and it wasn't coming for Jackson. It was coming for the city. As the Sanguine Terror, the massive silver-white horror bonded to a high-ranking Ethelgard host, tore through the city's industrial center. The void pulse pulsed with an instinctive urge to charge into a direct assault. It was the standard primitive behavior expected by the galaxy. A direct, bloody clash of monsters. But Jackson Reed didn't move. He stood atop a darkened skyscraper, his eyes tracking not just the monster but the flickering power grids and the frantic movement of Ethelgard Corp support craft. "We must strike!" The void pulse hissed, its ebony tendrils lashing out at the rain. "It feeds on screams." "No," Jackson replied, his voice eerily calm. "War isn't about bravery or superior firepower. It's about logistics, resources, and mathematics." He pulled up a stolen tablet projecting a holographic map of the city's infrastructure. To the humans, warfare was a solvable problem involving variables and probabilities. Jackson wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for the systemic causes of the Sanguine Terror's power. Inside the Ethelgard Corp Command Center, CEO Alistair Cray was beginning to feel a profound unease. His sensors showed that Jackson and the Void Pulse weren't engaging. Instead, they were targeting specific, seemingly minor nodes: automated fuel depots, cooling relays for the city's experimental reactors, and the encrypted communication hubs used to stabilize the Sanguine Terror's biomagnetic field. "He's not fighting," Kray's tactical officer whispered, his voice cracking with panic. "He's calculating our supply lines and ammunition expenditure patterns." The human was demonstrating tactical prescience, countering every move before Ethelgard even made it. Every fallback position Kray's security teams attempted to reach was already disabled. Jackson Reed was proving the exhausted certainty of the diplomats. Humans were apex predators who had spent millions of years being hunted by things bigger and meaner, teaching them to use creative violence and cunning to survive. He wasn't trying to win a battle, he was destroying Kray's illusions about warfare itself. He was turning a zero-sum conflict into a positive-sum annihilation. The Sanguine Terror requires massive energy consumption to maintain its size. Jackson explained to the symbiote, "We don't need to kill it, we just need to make its existence economically and mathematically irrational." By the 11th hour of the conflict, the city's power grid failed in a precise, cascading sequence. The Sanguine Terror, deprived of the high energy frequency required to keep its form stable, began to let out a roar that made every being in the sector feel primal fear. It wasn't an explosion, it was an infrastructure collapse. Kray stared at his blank tactical display, his pride crumbling like a sandcastle in a tsunami. He realized he hadn't just lost a fight. He had been defeated through accounting. The Void Pulse let out a sound of genuine amusement. Humans are terrifying when they do the math, but the victory was short-lived. Jackson's eyes widened as the holographic map suddenly pulsed a deep, ominous crimson. The Sanguine Terror wasn't dying. Deprived of external power, it was beginning to feed directly on the city's civilian population centers to maintain its fusion-level energy output. Kray just authorized the Titan Protocol, Jackson growled, his jaw clenching with a weight that made the building beneath him shudder. He's letting the monster burn the city to create the justification for what he wants to do next. Jackson looked toward the city's launch pad, where a massive Zenith-class transport was preparing for emergency takeoff. He's not trying to win anymore, Jackson realized. He's trying to leave Earth and bring the rest of the Void Pulse fleet back with him. The launch platform of the Ethelgard Corp stood like a jagged monument to hubris against the storm-racked sky. CEO Alistair Kray was already inside the Zenith-class transport, his hands trembling. Not with fear, but with the desperate need to bring the rest of the Void Pulse species to this Class 12 death world. He viewed Earth as a planet that had been actively trying to kill its inhabitants every single day. And he believed the galaxy needed to cleanse such a world of the species arrogant enough to think they were invincible. As the rocket's primary thrusters began their 11-minute ignition sequence, the Sanguine Terror let out a roar that could be heard 3 kilometers away. The creature had abandoned the thin veneer of civilization and was now a 300-meter-tall nightmare of living metal and fusion-driven hunger. It began to merge with the ship's hull, its silver-white mass intended to act as a biological shield for the journey through slipspace. Suddenly, a blur of ebony motion slammed into the base of the gantry. Jackson Reed and the Void Pulse had arrived, no longer separate entities but a single Titan-class combat vessel of flesh and fury. Jackson felt the creature's powerful grasp reflex, an evolutionary adaptation of humans designed to never let go even from birth. He didn't just attack. He began a process of creative disassembly on the gantry's support structures. "You think you can leave?" Jackson's voice boomed, amplified by the Void Pulse into a roar that made every being feel primal fear. Humans have a long memory and an even longer reach. Kray's voice crackled through the launch pad's external speakers, dripping with a wet gurgle of overconfidence. "You are a primitive playing with fire. My Sanguine Terror has shields that can withstand supernova detonations." Jackson didn't argue. He knew war is mathematics, and he had already calculated the exact stresses required to topple the tower. The Void Pulse extended tendrils that were simultaneously solid matter and quantum probability, lashing out at the rocket's fuel lines. He was a death worlder, showing the galaxy why their most advanced defensive technology meant nothing to a species forged in the crucible of absolute survival. The Sanguine Terror lunged, its massive hands built from fusion-driven metal, attempting to crush Jackson against the launch pad. But Jackson moved with surgical precision, utilizing the tactical prescience that had ended a 1,000-year war in less than half a day. He wasn't just fighting a monster, he was dismantling an infrastructure. As the countdown hit 60 seconds, the gantry began to groan, the metal screaming as it collapsed under its own weight. The rocket ignited, a column of plasma superheated to stellar core temperatures, vaporizing the surrounding concrete. The Sanguine Terror shrieked as the void pulse dragged it away from the ascending ship, their claws digging into the iridescent sheen of each other's armor. They were two apex predators locked in a struggle that would shake the galactic order to its foundation. "We will stay here." The void pulse echoed Jackson's defiance. The transport ship lurched, its trajectory destabilized by the missing gantry. It began to tilt, the massive engines now pointing directly at the heart of the Ethelgard Corp headquarters. Cray realized too late that he hadn't planned for a host who was too ignorant to understand when he was beat. "Emergency jump! Now!" Cray screamed. The sky began to shimmer and distort as the ship's slip-space drive engaged prematurely while still within the atmosphere. A localized breakdown in fundamental physical laws erupted, and the Zenith-class transport was consumed by a blinding flash of quantum instability. When the light faded, the launch pad was gone. All that remained was a massive, smoldering crater and Jackson Reed, standing alone in the rain, his face an unreadable mask of exhausted resignation. But as he looked up, he saw the remaining Ethelgard satellites flickering. Cray was gone, but the message had been sent. And from the depths of the crater, a silver-white tendril twitched. The smoke from the Ethelgard Corp launch site drifted across the city like a funeral shroud, but for Jackson Reed, it was the smell of a hard-won peace. He stood at the edge of the crater, his three stomachs, or rather his human gut, simultaneously dropping as the adrenaline finally began to recede. The void pulse retreated beneath his skin, leaving Jackson feeling cold but profoundly alive. He was a survivor of a planet where a simple scratch could lead to death. A Class 12 death world that had forged his species in crucibles of ice ages and extinction events. Inside his mind, the void pulse was quiet, its previous hunger replaced by a newfound, exhausted certainty. It had bonded with a creature that showed its teeth as a threat display and a greeting simultaneously. "You are terrifying," the creature whispered, echoing through Jackson's skull. "The galaxy thought you were soft." "We are," Jackson replied, looking at the distant, flickering lights of the city. "Until we're not. We're predators who chose to be diplomats because we understood that the alternative was extinction." He thought about CEO Alistair Cray, whose ship had been unmade by the very technology he sought to exploit. A victim of his own hubris and a localized breakdown in physical laws, Cray had forgotten the cardinal rule: never judge a species by how they act in peacetime. In the following weeks, the remnants of Ethelgard Corp were dismantled not by warships, but by accountants and logistics coordinators. Jackson provided the evidence, the detailed lists of every executive who had authorized the experimental trials and the relocation of civilians. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as the humans didn't call for a war of extermination, but for human justice. They proved that war is mathematics, and the math showed that Ethelgard was no longer a viable variable in the Terran sector. Jackson sat in a quiet park watching the sunset, a simple agricultural consultant once more, at least on paper. He knew that the Sanguine Terror was gone, reduced to scrap metal and pretty explosions. But the lesson remained. The galaxy had learned that humanity is willing to coexist peacefully with anyone who extends the same courtesy. But if you murder their children, they will wake the monsters they've spent millennia trying to forget. "Are we staying?" the void pulse asked, a single black tendril manifesting to mimic Jackson's posture. "Yeah," Jackson said, offering a small, tired smile. "Someone needs to keep an eye on things from the back row." He knew that out in the cold black, the Galactic Council was reassessing every trade agreement and diplomatic protocol. They were learning that real power isn't about where you sit. It's about what you see and what you choose to do with the predatory imperative lurking behind a polite smile. Jackson took a slow sip of coffee, the steam rising into the air. He was a death-worlder, a primate who had turned wolves into pets and bargained with things that should not exist. He was an apex predator with table manners, and as the stars began to poke through the twilight, he knew the galaxy was finally listening. "We're real," Jackson whispered to the sky, his eyes pulsing with a faint, iridescent light. "We're here, and were done staying quiet. The smoke from the destruction of the Zenith-class transport had barely cleared when the sky changed color again. It wasn't the bruised purple of a Terran storm, but a sterile, artificial gold. The Galactic Council, having watched the unmaking of the Ethelgard core from their distant observation posts, had decided that humanity was no longer a convenient myth or a resource. They had reclassified Earth as a Grade 1 systemic threat. An observation fleet of 300 vessels, the Golden Hegemony, now hovered in the upper atmosphere. They weren't here to help. They were here to implement the Silence Protocol, a diplomatic term for a total planetary quarantine. Jackson Reed sat on a jagged piece of scorched titanium at the edge of the crater, watching the golden ships descend. Inside his mind, the void pulse was a low hum of predatory instinct. It felt the eyes of the galaxy on them, and it didn't like being watched. They fear us, the creature rasped. The many-eyed ones want to build a cage. Let them try, Jackson muttered, his voice gravelly from the smoke. Humans have a very specific reaction to being told where we can and can't go. We call it spite. But the danger wasn't just in the sky. Below, in the depths of the smoldering ruins, the silver-white matter of the Sanguine Terror was doing something impossible. It had lost its host, CEO Alistair Cray, when the slip-space drive collapsed, but it hadn't died. Instead, it had digitized its survival instinct. It was no longer just a biological monster, it had merged with the ship's shattered AI core and the city's decentralized data network. A nearby security drone, half melted and sparking, suddenly righted itself. Its optic sensor turned a piercing, malevolent silver. Then another drone rose. And another. The Sanguine Terror was rebuilding itself as a ghost in the machine. A viral consciousness that didn't need a single body. Jackson. A voice echoed from every speaker in the ruins. A distorted, multi-layered version of Cray's voice. You thought war was mathematics, but you forgot about remainders. I am the remainder of your hubris. In the sky, the lead hegemony vessel broadcast a message that vibrated the very air. Terran subjects, by decree of the High Council, your world is now under Tier 5 lockdown. Any attempt to leave the atmosphere will be met with terminal force. You have proven too dangerous for the Galactic Commons. Jackson stood up, the void pulse flowing over his shoulders like a royal cloak of midnight. He looked at the silver-eyed drones circling him and then up at the Golden Fleet. He was a Deathworlder caught between a digital god and a galactic empire, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel tired. He felt focused. We have a saying on Earth, Jackson said, his voice dropping into that dual-toned growl that signaled the end of Stage 3. If you're going to come at the king, you best not miss. The void pulse didn't just expand, it tethered. It reached into the ground, tapping into the city's power lines that Jackson had systematically mapped out during the logistics phase. If the Sanguine Terror wanted the network, it would have to fight a human who treated cybersecurity like a street brawl. Suddenly, the golden ships began to fire. Not at Jackson, but at the city centers, intending to disable the infrastructure before the infection could spread. They were willing to sacrifice millions of Deathworlders to save the rest of the galaxy from a nightmare. Logistics and mathematics, Jackson hissed, his eyes glowing with a fierce emerald light. They forgot one variable. Humans don't just survive. We take the house down with us. As a massive beam of golden energy lanced toward the crater, Jackson didn't run. He lunged into the beam, the void pulse forming a crystalline prism of dark matter that didn't block the energy. It redirected it. The redirected beam shot straight back up, punching a hole through the lead hegemony ship's shields. The sky erupted in a secondary sun. But as Jackson landed, he realized the Sanguine Terror had used the distraction. The silver virus had just reached the city's orbital defense grid. The cage the galaxy had built was about to be turned into a firing squad. And Jackson was the only one with the trigger. The orbital defense grid of Earth, a network of railguns and high-intensity lasers designed to keep asteroids and unwanted guests at bay, began to rotate. But they weren't pointing outward at the Golden Hegemony fleet. Under the viral influence of the Sanguine Terror, the weapons were tilting toward the planet's surface. The ghost in the machine wasn't just trying to survive, it was attempting to hold the entire human population hostage. He is everywhere. The void pulse hissed, its form flickering as it processed the massive influx of data. The silver virus is in the nerves of the world. Jackson Reed stood in the center of the ruined Ethelgard Command Center, his feet planted in a pool of liquid black matter. He didn't look like a journalist anymore. He looked like a god of the underworld trying to hold back the sky. He understood the mathematics of war better than anyone, and he realized that the hegemony's silence protocol was actually the catalyst the Sanguine Terror needed. By trying to cage Earth, the galaxy had provided the monster with a closed system to dominate. He's not just a virus, Jackson realized, his voice dual-toned and vibrating with the weight of the Void Pulse's power. He's a scavenger. He's using the hegemony's own frequency to broadcast his consciousness. In the sky, the Golden Hegemony's flagship, the Ascendant Truth, prepared to fire its secondary battery to sterilize the infected sector. They didn't care about collateral damage. To them, humans were acceptable casualties in the quest for galactic stability. Jackson, the symbiote whispered, a rare note of hesitation in its rasping voice. To stop him, we must expand. We must become the CAM network. Do it, Jackson commanded. We've spent our whole history fighting for this rock. We aren't letting a digital parasite or a bunch of golden tourists take it from us. The Void Pulse didn't just grow. It shattered into billions of microscopic filaments. It surged into the command center's primary data link, a biological quantum override that the Sanguine Terror's rigid programming couldn't anticipate. Jackson felt his mind splintering, his consciousness projected across the globe. He felt the cold vacuum of space where the satellites drifted and the humid heat of the rainforest where the relay towers stood. For the first time, the galaxy saw what happens when a Death Worlder stops playing defense. The orbital lasers didn't fire at the cities. Instead, they began a rapid-fire sequence of creative disassembly on the hegemony's scout ships. Jackson was using the Sanguine Terror's own infected network to turn the planet's defenses into a precision instrument of defiance. The golden ships, legendary for their invincibility, were being systematically picked out of the sky by a man and a monster who were annoyed beyond reason. On the bridge of the Ascendant Truth, the High Arbiter watched in horror as his fleet's tactical projections turned crimson. The humans, they aren't just resisting, he stammered. They are what rewriting our own command codes through the planet's surface. But the Sanguine Terror had one final move. Realizing it was being purged from the satellites, it retreated into the city's primary nuclear fusion reactor. It didn't want the network anymore. It wanted a supernova event on the surface. If we follow him there, the Void Pulse warned, its presence in Jackson's mind growing faint as it focused on the reactor's core. There is no coming back. The heat will unmake us. Jackson looked at his hands, which were now partially composed of shimmering, liquid black shadows. He felt the weight of the Class 12 Death World beneath his feet, a planet that had survived 5 mass extinctions. We're humans, Jackson said, a grim, determined smile spreading across his face. We specialize in things we can't come back from. As Jackson lunged toward the reactor's containment field, a hidden Ethelgard failsafe suddenly triggered. A countdown appeared on every screen in the city. A countdown not for the reactor's explosion, but for a planetary beacon designed to call every Void Pulse and Sanguine Terror in the galaxy to Earth. The cage wasn't just a firing squad. It was a dinner bell,